Tony Beets has spent decades tearing through frozen Yukon ground in search of gold. Old tools, rusted machinery, and forgotten mining gear show up all the time. But one day, when a bulldozer blade struck something deep underground, the sound that echoed through the cut told the crew this was different. Late-season mining in the Yukon always carries a certain urgency. As the colder months approach, every hour of work becomes valuable. For Tony Beets and his crew, the final stretch of the season often means pushing equipment harder and running longer shifts in order to reach the richest layers of pay dirt before winter locks the ground solid again. On that particular afternoon, the operation was moving at full pace, with machines spread across the cut and engines rumbling steadily beneath the gray northern sky. A bulldozer operator was working along the edge of a freshly opened section of ground, slowly pushing a thick layer of overburden away to expose the pay layer beneath. The blade of the massive machine carved through frozen soil and gravel, sending piles of dirt sliding across the cut. It was routine work, something the operator had done hundreds of times before. Most of the time, the blade simply pushed through dirt, occasionally scraping against buried rocks that had been locked in the ground for thousands of years. But then the machine jolted suddenly. The bulldozer shuddered hard enough to force the operator forward in his seat. The blade had struck something solid beneath the soil, bringing the heavy machine to an abrupt stop. At first, the operator assumed it was simply another large rock buried in the ground. That happened often enough in Yukon mining cuts, but the sound that followed the impact immediately made him pause. Instead of the dull crunch of stone, the blade had produced a sharp metallic scrape that echoed through the surrounding pit. The operator eased off the controls and let the engine idle while he leaned forward in the cab, staring down at the section of ground where the blade had hit. Dirt and gravel had been pushed aside by the impact, exposing a small patch of something darker beneath the soil. He grabbed the radio. "Blade just hit something down here," he said. Within minutes, the message reached Tony Beets, who was working on another part of the operation. Tony had spent most of his life around heavy equipment and mining ground, and he had learned that unusual sounds in a cut were never something to ignore. When a bulldozer hit something unexpected, it could mean anything from buried scrap metal to equipment left behind decades earlier. Tony climbed into his truck and drove toward the section of the cut where the machine had stopped. By the time he arrived, the bulldozer operator had stepped out of the cab and was standing near the front of the machine, staring down at the ground. A few other crew members had gathered nearby, curious about what the blade had struck. Tony walked over and looked at the exposed section of dirt in front of the bulldozer. At first glance, it didn't look like much. But as he crouched down and brushed away some loose soil with his boot, the edge of something metallic appeared beneath the dirt. The shape was smooth, flat, and clearly man-made. Tony straightened slowly and looked across the cut for a moment, thinking carefully. The section of ground they were working had not been disturbed in decades. Much of that land had remained frozen and untouched since long before modern equipment ever reached the area. He knelt again and scraped a little more dirt away from the surface. The metal continued deeper into the ground, and the longer Tony stared at it, the more obvious something became. Whatever the bulldozer had hit wasn't just scrap metal buried by accident. It looked like something that had been placed there on purpose. The strange shape beneath the dirt. After Tony Beets spotted the edge of metal beneath the bulldozer blade, the mood around the cut shifted almost immediately. What had begun as a routine push of overburden had now turned into something far more interesting. Discoveries in mining cuts were not unusual. Old buckets, broken tools, and rusted pieces of machinery often appeared after decades underground. But the surface Tony had uncovered did not look like the typical scrap miners found buried in old ground. Tony stood quietly for a moment, studying the exposed metal while the bulldozer idled behind him. The large machine's engine rumbled steadily, sending small vibrations through the ground beneath their boots. Around him, several crew members leaned closer to get a better look at what had been uncovered. "Clear some more dirt around it," Tony finally said. The bulldozer operator nodded and carefully climbed back into the cab. Instead of pushing forward again, he reversed the machine slightly and lowered the blade just enough to scrape a thin layer of soil away from the object without damaging whatever lay beneath. Slowly, the heavy steel blade pushed loose gravel aside, exposing a wider section of the buried structure. More metal appeared. The surface was surprisingly smooth despite being underground for so many years. It didn't look like the twisted remains of old equipment or discarded tools. Instead, it had the clean edges of something that had once been built carefully and deliberately. The crew gathered closer as the shape began to emerge. One of the younger workers crouched down and brushed away dirt with his gloves, revealing more of the object's outline. The metal extended deeper into the ground than anyone had expected. "That's not small," he said quietly. Tony nodded but didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the exposed surface as he tried to understand what they were looking at. Over the years, he had seen almost every kind of object turn up in Yukon mining cuts. Old mining gear from previous operations was common. Sometimes prospectors buried scrap metal simply to get it out of the way. But this didn't feel like scrap. The object had a shape that seemed too deliberate. Another worker grabbed a shovel and began clearing dirt from one side of the metal surface. With each scoop of soil removed, the outline of the buried structure became a little clearer. What they were uncovering looked like a large metal panel, or possibly the side of some kind of container. Tony stepped closer again and crouched down to examine the edges more carefully. Old paystreak material. In the Klondike, gold rarely spreads evenly through the ground. Instead, it concentrates along narrow channels where ancient rivers once flowed. Over thousands of years, those channels fill with sediment, burying the gold beneath layers of gravel and clay. Miners call these channels paystreaks. Finding one can transform an ordinary claim into a fortune. Tony walked slowly across the area again, following the faint line of darker gravel as it stretched beneath the remains of two collapsed cabins. It did not look random. In fact, it looked almost like the edge of an old creek bed. That possibility immediately raised an important question. Had the miners who built this camp known about it? The site dated back more than a century to the earliest years of the Klondike gold rush. During that time, prospectors flooded the region, chasing rumors of rich deposits hidden beneath the frozen ground. But the tools they used were primitive compared to modern mining equipment. Much of their work relied on manual digging or small steam-powered machines that could only reach limited depths. If a rich pay streak existed beneath this camp, those early miners might have discovered only the very top of it, or worse. They might have stopped digging just before reaching the richest layer. Tony stood quietly for several moments thinking about that possibility. One of the crew members looked around the camp and asked the obvious question. "So you think they missed something?" Tony shrugged slightly. "Maybe." He pointed toward the darker gravel line again. "Or maybe they started something they couldn't finish." That idea began to take shape the longer Tony studied the ground. If the early miners had discovered signs of gold beneath the camp, they may have built their structures directly above the promising ground to protect their claim while they worked. But mining in the early 1900s was difficult. Equipment failures were common. Water flooding underground shafts was even more common. Any number of problems could have forced them to abandon the operation before reaching the deeper layers. And if that happened, the pay streak beneath the camp might still be sitting exactly where they left it, untouched, waiting. Tony kicked at the gravel near his feet, exposing more of the darker material. It continued in the same direction. Consistent. That was what interested him the most. Random patches of dark soil meant little, but a consistent layer suggested structure. And structure meant the possibility of an ancient channel. In the Yukon, ancient channels are where the real gold lives. Tony finally stood up and looked across the entire campsite again. The old buildings suddenly felt less like obstacles and more like markers. Markers that someone long ago believed this ground was valuable. One of the crew members asked if they should start clearing the area. Tony paused for a moment before answering. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Let's see what's under it," because if his instincts were right, the forgotten ground beneath that abandoned mining camp might be hiding something extraordinary, something the original miners came incredibly close to finding, and something that could be worth millions. Clearing the abandoned mining camp was not simple work. The buildings had stood there for more than a century, slowly surrendering to Yukon winters that are never gentle. Roof beams sagged under the weight of old snowfalls. Walls leaned at strange angles. Rusted metal was scattered everywhere across the site. Before anyone could even think about digging, the entire area had to be cleared. Tony Beets had done this kind of work before. Old mining sites are often like time capsules, frozen pieces of history left behind when the first gold rush miners moved on to chase their next rumor of fortune. But this camp felt different, not because of what stood above the ground, because of what might lie beneath it. The crew began removing debris piece by piece. Old timber from collapsed cabins was hauled away. Sections of rusted piping were dragged to the side of the claim. Even the remains of an ancient boiler had to be carefully moved before heavy machinery could safely enter the area. The process took days. Every step forward revealed more reminders of the miners who had once lived and worked there. Broken tools appeared in the gravel. Bent iron nails surfaced among the stones. At one point, someone uncovered the remains of a lantern buried deep in the dirt, its glass shattered long ago. It was a strange feeling. Those early miners had come to the Yukon chasing exactly the same dream Tony Beets was still chasing today: gold. Yet somewhere along the way, their story ended right here. And now, more than 100 years later, Tony was about to continue digging where they left off. Once the site was finally cleared enough for excavation, the machines moved in. The excavator bucket bit into the ground slowly at first. The top layers were nothing surprising. Loose gravel mixed with sand and clay, exactly the kind of overburden miners expect to remove before reaching anything valuable. But Tony was watching closely. He was waiting for the layer he had noticed during his first walk across the camp, that darker band of gravel that had caught his attention. It appeared sooner than expected. About 2 feet beneath the surface, the color of the soil began to change. The gravel became darker, heavier, slightly more compact than the loose material above it. Tony climbed down into the shallow cut to take a closer look. He knelt beside the exposed layer and scooped up a handful of the gravel. The weight of it immediately felt different. That was the first sign. Anyone who has spent enough years mining gold learns to recognize pay dirt not just by sight, but by feel. The sediment that carries gold often has a denser texture because heavier minerals collect in the same places where gold settles. Tony let the gravel slide slowly through his fingers. He did not say anything for several seconds. One of the crew members standing above the trench finally spoke. "Well?" Tony looked up. "Bring me a pan." The request was simple but significant. A gold pan is the oldest and most reliable tool a miner has. Even with modern wash plants capable of processing massive amounts of gravel, the humble pan still reveals the truth hidden in a handful of dirt. A small sample of the darker gravel was placed into the pan and submerged in water. The crew gathered quietly around the trench. Tony began the slow circular motion that separates heavier material from lighter sediment. The water carried away sand and fine gravel while the heavier particles settled toward the bottom of the pan. At first there was nothing, just dark sand and tiny stones. Tony kept swirling the pan carefully, letting more of the lighter material wash away. Then something caught the light. One tiny fleck, barely visible, but unmistakable. Gold. Tony did not react dramatically. He simply tilted the pan slightly, revealing the small speck resting against the darker sand at the bottom. One of the crew members leaned closer. "That's gold, isn't it?" Tony nodded once. "It's gold." The discovery was small, just a single fleck. But in mining, even a tiny piece of gold can tell an important story. Where there is one fleck, there are often more. Still, Tony knew better than to draw conclusions too quickly. Gold can appear randomly in the ground. A single test pan is never enough to prove the value of an entire layer. They needed more samples. The excavator continued digging carefully along the darker band of gravel, exposing more of the layer as it stretched across the excavation. Another sample was collected. Another pan was filled. This time the results were different. When the lighter sediment washed away, several tiny flakes of gold appeared along the bottom edge of the pan. Not just one. Several. A quiet murmur spread through the crew. Tony studied the pan closely. The flakes were small but consistent. That was what mattered most. Consistency suggested that the gold was not random. It was part of a larger deposit. Tony looked toward the section of ground where the darker gravel continued beneath the remaining portion of the old camp. If the pay layer extended under those structures, There could be a significant amount of gold still trapped in the ground. But before anyone could celebrate, the excavator bucket struck something unexpected. A dull, cracking sound echoed through the trench. The operator immediately stopped digging. Tony stepped closer to the exposed edge of the cut. Something wooden had appeared in the wall of the excavation. At first, it looked like random debris, another piece of old lumber buried beneath the camp. But as more of the surrounding gravel was carefully removed, the shape became clearer. It was not random at all. The wood formed straight lines, heavy beams arranged in a structured pattern. Tony stared at the exposed timbers for several seconds, because what they had just uncovered did not belong to the surface camp. This structure was deeper, older, and built with a very specific purpose. One of the crew members climbed down into the trench and brushed away more dirt from the wood. The outline became unmistakable. A reinforced frame. The entrance to an old mining shaft. For a moment, the entire crew stood silently around the excavation. The discovery changed everything. It meant the early miners who built the camp had not simply scratched the surface of the ground. They had been digging deeper, much deeper. And if that shaft followed the same gold-bearing layer Tony had just tested, it suggested something extraordinary. Those long-forgotten miners may have already discovered the pay streak beneath the camp. They may have even been chasing it underground. But for some reason, they never finished the job. And now, more than a century later, Tony Beets was standing in the exact spot where their search had stopped. With modern equipment, and a growing suspicion that the gold they were chasing might still be there, waiting just beneath the ground. The moment the wooden structure emerged from the gravel, the entire atmosphere around the excavation changed. What had started as a routine test dig now carried the weight of something much older, something unfinished. Tony Beets stood at the edge of the trench, staring down at the thick timber beams that had been buried beneath more than a century of Yukon soil. The wood was dark and worn but surprisingly intact, preserved by the cold ground that had sealed it away for generations. It was not random debris from the surface camp. The beams had been placed carefully, deliberately. Anyone familiar with early Klondike mining recognized the design immediately. This was the reinforced entrance to a shaft. One of the crew brushed more gravel away from the exposed wood, while another leaned closer, studying the construction. "So, they were digging down," someone said quietly. Tony nodded. "Looks that way." The structure told a clear story. During the early years of the Klondike gold rush, rounded stones rolled across the floor of the trench as the bucket lifted away. Tony climbed down into the cut and scooped up a fresh sample from the newly exposed section. "Pan," he said. The word carried a quiet weight now. The crew gathered around as the gravel was poured into the gold pan and lowered into the water. Tony began the slow circular motion again, washing away the lighter sand and sediment. At first, the bottom of the pan looked like nothing more than dark sand. Then something caught the light, one flake. Then another. Tony continued washing carefully. More gold appeared. Not just scattered dust this time. Small flakes gathered in the corner of the pan, forming a thin but unmistakable line of yellow against the black sand. Someone leaned closer. "That's a lot more than the first test." Tony tilted the pan slightly, studying the growing cluster of flakes. Then he stopped moving the pan entirely, because something larger had just appeared. Resting near the edge of the sediment was a small nugget. It was not enormous, but it was unmistakably solid gold. For a moment, no one spoke. Even after years of mining, finding a nugget still carries a certain electricity. Nuggets suggest something important. They often appear closer to the source of a richer deposit, where heavier gold pieces have not yet been broken down by long distances of water movement. Tony reached down and carefully picked it up. The nugget sat in his palm, dull and irregular, its surface worn smooth by centuries underground. One of the crew members broke the silence. "So this whole layer might be carrying nuggets like that?" Tony did not answer immediately. He simply looked back across the exposed trench, where the pay layer continued disappearing beneath the remaining ground that had not yet been excavated. If nuggets were already appearing at this stage, the deeper portions of the deposit could potentially hold much more. He finally spoke. "Well," he said calmly, "that's interesting. It was the kind of understated reaction that had become typical for Tony Beets. But the crew understood exactly what it meant. They had just uncovered the strongest evidence yet that the forgotten ground beneath the abandoned mining camp might contain serious gold, possibly a lot of it. And if the deposit they were standing on could be worth far more than anyone had imagined, maybe even millions in gold still buried beneath the Yukon soil. As evening settled over the Yukon Valley, the abandoned mining camp no longer looked forgotten. Only days earlier, the ground had been covered with collapsing cabins, rusted machinery, and debris left behind by miners who walked away more than a century ago. Now the site had been transformed into a wide excavation, exposing layers of earth that had not seen daylight for generations. Tony Beets stood quietly at the edge of the trench. Below him, the darker pay layer stretched across the cut, clearly visible now that the overburden had been removed. The small nugget discovered earlier rested in a gold pan nearby, surrounded by flakes collected from the test samples. It was not a massive discovery yet, but it was enough to prove something important. There was real gold beneath the old camp, and possibly a lot more. Tony had spent enough years mining the Klondike to know that early results do not guarantee success. Gold deposits can change quickly underground. A pay streak that looks promising in one section can disappear just a few feet away. Still, the signs they had uncovered were difficult to ignore. The darker gravel layer appeared consistent across the site. Multiple samples had produced gold. The nugget suggested that heavier pieces might exist deeper along the channel. And the old shaft they uncovered told an even more intriguing story. Those early miners had clearly been chasing the same layer Tony had just exposed. They had invested time and effort digging into the ground, building reinforced timber structures to support their shaft, which meant they likely knew the ground carried gold. But for reasons lost to history, they never finished the job. Now Tony Beets had something those miners never had: modern equipment, powerful excavators, efficient wash plants capable of processing massive amounts of gravel every day. Ground that was once impossible to mine could now be worked with precision and speed. If the pay streak extended beyond the boundaries of the old camp and maintained the gold values they were already seeing, the claim could turn into one of the most surprising discoveries of the season. Some members of the crew were already whispering about the possibility. Millions in gold. Tony himself did not make bold predictions. Experience had taught him that mining rewards patience more than optimism. But as he looked across the exposed trench, one thing felt clear. Beneath that abandoned mining camp was a story that had been waiting more than a century to be finished. And Tony Beets might finally be the miner who uncovers the ending. Gold mining is full of surprises, but discoveries like this remind us that the Klondike still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoy stories about hidden gold, legendary miners, and the high-stakes world of the Yukon, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Because the next big discovery might already be buried somewhere beneath the frozen ground, just waiting for someone bold enough to dig.